Hello, I'm back. I've returned with less hair and a more confident attitude. Time to review something which really is a lot different to what I've reviewed so far on this channel. First World War, A Complete History by Martin Gilbert. I've got very little experience reviewing something like this because I've not only never read any First World War books, I've never even read any history before. I mean, I did history A-level, but they just gave us extracts and accounts and things. I guess I'd have to read whole books if I'd gone into degree level history, but I did English and creative writing probably and will end up unemployed. So don't really rely on this review that much because I don't have anything to judge the book against. But I think I've got a lot to say about it anyway, because it was a very intriguing read. I think the reason I chose the First World War as my first foray into history is because I feel like the Second World War is probably the single most covered period of history of all time. There's so many films about it, there's so many books, songs, people talk about it all the time, it always gets taught in schools, and obviously we've got Remembrance Day, but the First World War does not, apart from that, get talked about nearly enough. The Second World War has completely eclipsed it, and a lot of the time people just see the First World War as sort of a precursor to the Second World War, something that led to the rise of Hitler, and indeed it was. But on the other hand, I do feel like we need to know about the First World War, because in a way it was more pointless than the Second World War, ultimately more futile. Maybe the reason that the First World War gets a lot less coverage than the Second is because I think the Second World War is based really on radicalism of key figures and their insanity, Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese emperor. But the First World War is a symbol of no single person's insanity, but the insanity of an entire system, the whole world thought of that period. And in many ways, that's a more mundane and less interesting insanity. But on the other hand, it's a lot more troubling. It wasn't really picked out as extremism at the time because it was just so widespread. That's what's so interesting and sort of more troubling about the First World War. While the Second was created out of necessity, we needed to fight off Hitler and his regime, and I mean, some people will say we could have solved it another way. I don't know who those people are, but I'm sure they're out there. But the First World War was really, they found excuses to fight it, but essentially it was just because people wanted a war. They thought war was fun. They thought it was a good test of their newfound military prowess, and it made the world realise that this was not a good reason to have a war at all. And I think they've sort of learned their lesson. I mean, there's lots of pointless wars in history since then, but I don't think any are quite as pointless as the First World War. So the book itself, written by Martin Gilbert, who was a British knight and a member of the Chilcot Inquiry, so he's quite accomplished. Well, he's dead now, but he was quite accomplished when he was alive, and when he wrote this book. So we know we're in safe hands from the start, and I will tell you, it's a very informative book. I think one of the best things about the book is the way it has so many first-person accounts of the battle and so many extracts of war poetry. It's sort of like a collage of various sources, which a lot of people would say history basically was that collage of first-hand accounts that Martin Gilbert has found and cobbled together. Obviously, he writes a narrative of events as well. It's not just a collection, but the frequent first-hand accounts really bring the visceral impact of the war, and they sort of make the book more enjoyable because it's like reading poetry, or sometimes it is reading poetry. But even the bits that aren't actually poetry, they're very poetic often, and they bring you right into the battlefield, and they sort of temper the quite coldly written narrative of the text. Another good thing about the book, although as I said I don't have anything to test it against, is just how damn informative it is. There are so many statistics and descriptions of various days of battle, and there's a lot of detail, and these are probably in other First World War books, but I think Martin Gilbert's definitely got a grasp of his material. He knows what went on, and and he sort of shocks you with those figures in a perfect matter-of-fact way, and they never stop being shocking, really. However, I think one problem with this book is the way that he doesn't really give his opinion on any of the events, and a lot of people have said this about his works in general, as a criticism or a praise, depending on who it is, but a lot of history books, I'm told, as I said, it's the first history book I've read, purely history book, will dwell on the events and wonder why it happened, sort of more meandering and more thoughtful. And even though some people would probably say that was time wasting, they just want the facts right now. I'm the sort of person who likes thinking about things philosophically and moralistically, and I think the book would be a lot more interesting if he had that sort of thoughtful debate going, because, as I said, the first-person accounts temper it, but a lot of the time the narrative, even though the events being described are interesting, it's written in quite a cold, calculating way. The description of events, just the facts. It often feels like Martin Gilbert doesn't really have his own opinion, which I'm sure isn't true. And in a way, for the first book I read about the First World War, it's probably quite useful that I've got such a supposedly neutral account, although it's clearly biased towards the British, because it says loads of German atrocities, but it doesn't say many British ones, apart from the blockade, but that's very public knowledge, and they couldn't really skip that one out. But I'm sure there must have been horrific incidents of the British Army doing things that he's neglected to mention because he's a British knight. But on the surface, the narrative's quite neutral, and although that's probably useful for my education, it's not very interesting to read. I'm going to refrain from giving it a grade because I can't really properly grade a book which I don't have anything to compare it to. It's the first purely history book I've read in my life, apart from starting a book about the Borgias, but I never finished that one, and it was one with pictures, so it was probably for children. So, just take away my comments in the early review, and the comments now, I will say that overall it was very interesting, and although a lot of the time I didn't enjoy it because of the repetitive nature of the battles, just more offences and more people getting killed. That's not really Martin Gilbert's fault. That's the nature of war, and military history is going to be like that, no matter what.